but it's possible to do this. And I see guys around here where we're dealing with wet ground, we're dealing with intensive systems, and they do manage to do it very well by clever use of flukicides early in the year, by preserving ground and preserving pasture for finishing lambs later in the year that isn't heavily contaminated. And there are ways of doing it.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this week's episode, we chat to Veterinarian McGettrick, who's a laboratory manager at Department of Agriculture's Regional Veterinary Lab in County Sligo, about the fluke challenge this winter. We start off discussing the department's fluke forecast and how it may be a more challenging season for fluke. We move on to discuss treatment, with Shane highlighting the importance of choosing the correct active ingredient, potential flukicide resistance, and why it's important to work with your vet to put a control program in place on your farm. We finish up discussing rumen fluke and the risk it may pose in certain farms. We start off, however, with Shane discussing what fluke-related issues they're seeing in the lab at this point in the season.
We're seeing a lot of fluke at the minute. I'm based here in a lab in the northwest in Sligo, and we see a lot of fluke every year. But this year in particular, from speaking to my colleagues in the other RVLs around the country, I think it's a thing that everyone is seeing plenty of fluke, even places that would have prided themselves on having very few cases of fluke, having such dry land, but they're all seeing it this time of year, this year. The main type of fluke we're seeing this time of year is acute fluke. Acute fluke is caused by the larval stages of the parasite as it's migrating through the liver. And that happens at the back end of the year when the ground has become very contaminated by the infective stages, and you've got these usually younger animals out grazing, grazing hard, grazing tight to the ground, maybe on wetter patches of ground that maybe heavier cattle and things like that haven't been able to graze, and you get a large number of these infective stages of the fluke swallowed, and they begin to migrate through the liver, and they cause a very, very severe hepatitis, which then can cause diarrhea, and which causes the animal to not be able to regulate its own protein, and you get animals that can die very suddenly even without the normal diarrhea that you might expect if they had lower numbers of fluke there. So as a rule of thumb, generally the back end of the year we see mostly acute fluke in young animals, and then we still all the time in the background you'll get a certain amount of chronic fluke, but usually in older animals, and usually in places where there isn't just as high a burden that there isn't enough larvae there to kill off the animal.
I think that last point you touched on, Shane's important. Like, the challenge on pasture is going to have a bearing on whether it's acute or chronic fluke.
Yeah. So when it comes to fluke, it's all about the challenge on the pasture. It's a huge thing, and it's a thing that I think that farmers and need to realise that as the year goes on, the number of these infective stage of the fluke larvae are building underground. Fluke has a complicated life cycle. It relies on an intermediate host, which is a snail. Now, theoretically, that snail is only active during the summer months and the warmer months of the year. But with the way that we've been having very mild, wet weather, right up without frost, right up until, sometimes Christmas, some years, that leaves that snail very active. And that snail produces huge amount of these infective larvae that then cause the damage in the sheep. So it's the contamination of that has built up right from, we'll say, even from March, April in the year, building on the ground. And then it reaches a crescendo as we come towards the end of the year. And it's the number of those infective larvae that's on the grass blades that the sheep come in then and mop up that causes the real acute damage. Chronic damage is caused by fluke that are able to complete their life cycle. So a fluke that, if there isn't that many fluke that get into the liver there, the fluke go through their life stages in the sheep, and they get to an adult stage, they go out into the gallbladder and they start to produce eggs. And that's what you'll see in chronic fluke. There'll be a certain amount of damage in the liver there, but the livers are actually very good at healing. So as long as they're not overwhelmed completely, the liver will heal. You'll get some chronic scarring going on in the liver, but generally it won't be enough to kill the animal unless it builds up season after season. So chronic fluke, we see more problems with that in older sheep that have been exposed to this low level of contamination, this low level of infection throughout numerous seasons. And that's a very important point when it comes to try and understand, what a dung sample and the results of a dung sample mean.
I suppose just, and we state absolute basics here, but just to put all in context, as you indicated earlier, in the acute stage, it can easily cause mortality. In the chronic phase, it is debilitating. It's going to reduce performance. It's going to leave sheep open to other diseases as well. So they're all production limiting.
Yes, they are. The acute fluke tends to grab the headlines because what we see in that is you'll see young lambs, often lambs that are being prepared for slaughter that are die off. And it can be very severe in a flock. You can get a very large mortality rate there, and never mind the ones that are set back after it. So that tends to grab the headlines. But it is important to remember that when you've got bad fluke on a farm, that the damage that's done to the liver never fully goes away. There's a cumulative effect of that scarring that's going on and on there in the liver. You're beginning to get a liver that's less able to function properly. It's less able to contribute to the digestion that the animal needs it for. And so we see these older sheep then with this cumulative damage over seasons that aren't able to perform for as long as you'd expect them to do. So you see higher cull rates in farms with those problems. And you see problems with them getting back in lamb. You see problems with them being able to care for lambs in the springtime. So it is a fluke problem on a farm. I think in Ireland, I tell people it's probably the most significant thing disease-wise that they have to deal with.
Shane, just in terms of the level of challenge this year, it's been a particularly wet year. I'm conscious that the department fluke forecast came out the past 2 weeks. I know it's difficult to paint a picture over the whole country, particularly where you are in the northwest. This is par for the course. But I'll throw the question, is this a slightly riskier year? Is it one where potentially, and particularly given the weather we've had up in the this recent cold snap, it's been quite mild, is it potentially a year where the fluke risk will continue for longer?
Yeah. So, as you say, the department's fluke forecast was published, I think about 2 weeks ago now, and that's compiled from two basic data sets that I suppose I better explain. The first data set is the meteorological data. So it's coming from the Met Office, looking at the temperatures and the rainfall that have occurred throughout the year. And it's all compiled by a mathematical model into what's called the All-Lorentz index. And we're used to this in the Northwest, in that it always seems to be high risk when it comes to weather along the Western seaboard. It's just the way it goes. But what we're seeing this year is that the whole country is actually in a higher risk status than in previous years. So even looking down at the drier parts of the country in the southeast, now, although they're not at the stage where I think it's above 500 or above 400, we talk about disease being prevalent. But a lot of the ones in the southeast of the country are between 300 and 400, which means that there can be occasional disease there in flocks, which is, it strikes me as higher this year than I would have seen it in previous years. So a lot comes into play then, depending on the local environment and the quality of the land that the person is dealing with and the type of habitats that's there for the snails and the burdens that are on the farm. So that's the meteorological side of it. The other thing that goes into compiling the fluke forecast is we do a survey of lamb bloods that are going through abattoirs. So really what we're doing on these bloods is we're looking to see if these lambs have been exposed to fluke up until the point that they're slaughtered. And we're measuring the immune response in them. So what we're seeing in that, it's less pronounced than the weather forecast. What we're seeing in that, as we expect always, we're seeing a lot of flocks in the northwest and along the west of the country that have been exposed to fluke already in the year. What we haven't seen is a huge amount of positive flocks coming from the east of the country, but I'm a little bit worried about that, in that I think we need to put in a caveat there that it's still early days, and that was compiled, in the over the summer months, and there is, based on the weather that we've had this year, there is a chance that we would expect that there would be flocks in the east of the country that would be exposed as the year goes on, and as it's not too late for that to have occurred. The third thing, and it's not directly sheep related, but as part of the department monitoring through the beef check scheme that goes through the cattle that go through the abattoirs, we're seeing a lot of liver fluke in cattle, again very much on the western side, but there seems to be more of it also from eastern counties as well, so that's out southern counties. So the indicators point towards this being a difficult year in terms of fluke, and what I'd be worried about in farms in the southeastern part of the country especially is that maybe they haven't factored in fluke, or that maybe they wouldn't be as used to having it as a problem in their flocks. And just to be aware that if they see things that looks like fluke, it could be fluke this year, and maybe they mightn't have had it in years, but they might get it this year just based on the data we're seeing.
No, I think it's important, right? Like, look, farm history is probably one of the biggest things to kick into this, but as you indicated there, like, this has been a particularly wet year. It's in theory ideal conditions for it. So, the basics of observing, of checking, and if you think you have a problem, going and seeking a bit of advice on it. It's a different year than we've seen previously.
It is. It's been a wetter year throughout the summer, especially the end of the summer. And again, this goes back. It's all about that snail and its habitat. So it goes back to that wet weather conditions makes a better habitat for the snail, so its population is able to thrive. You put that together on a farm with, as you say, the previous history. So if you've got fluke on that farm, if you've got older animals that have been spreading even small numbers of fluke eggs out that are infecting these snails throughout the wetter months of the summer, then there is a danger and there is a risk in some of these farms that we're going to have a lot of larvae present that are going to infect animals later on in the year.
Shane, in terms of control, look, we could talk about reducing habitats and that, but in practical terms, we're dependent on treating these animals. Correct choice of treatment, and when I'm asking this, I'm conscious that there is some resistance out there. It's something we talk about the whole time, but frequently, and I'm sure this happens to you more than most, when you see a problem, when you do the case history, where they may have been treated for fluke, the choice of product mightn't have been appropriate for the time of year. Maybe just put that in context for me. The correct choice of treatment for this stage of the season, the impact that can have, and what levels of resistance you're potentially seeing on farms.
Yeah. So when it comes to treatment, and I want to talk a little bit about resistance as we go on, but when it comes to treatment of fluke, you need to pick a product that's going to kill the stage of the fluke that's causing the disease. So at this time of year, so from autumn onwards, you need something that's active against the larvae that are in the liver. So you're talking about products that are active against immature stages of liver fluke. In summertime and in springtime, what you need there is you need to try and prevent contamination of the ground. So it's the adults that produce the eggs that contaminate the ground. So at that stage of the year, it's fine to treat them with something that's going to kill off the adult stages. What we see in the labs, and every year, and it's heartbreaking to see it when it happens, but every year we see the same thing. We see guys that come into us with high mortality, high morbidity, flocks of sheep that are very badly set back. large numbers of losses. We open them up on the PM table. It's acute fluke. Their livers are shot. They're being destroyed by larvae. And, on the submission sheet and when they're coming in, they tell us that they have dosed them, that they've been done. And at that stage, unfortunately it's the phone call that you don't want to be getting from me, where you're trying to go back over the history to explain how come what you thought was going to work didn't work. And time again, when we make that phone call and when we talk to the people involved, it's that they have used the wrong product. It's that they have underestimated the level of contamination of these infective stages of fluke that are on their ground, and then that they have, even when they know that they have to treat for fluke, that they've picked a product that it is not active against the stages that are going to cause the disease for them. So we'll say probably the most effective product in terms of killing early stages, and again, as long as there isn't a resistance problem, is triclobendazoles. They're our go-to product when we want to take on acute fluke, followed then by ones that work against some of the late immature stages, things like your clazanthals, your nitroxanils. Very important to understand that a lot of the white drenches, the albendazoles, they have very little effect against the larval stages. So they're fine for dealing with adult fluke, but they're not going to do much to help you out when your livers are being attacked by huge numbers of these larvae that the young lambs are hoovering up from highly contaminated ground.
Jane, we touched on resistance with triclobenazole. I suppose it was a victim of its own success in terms of its effective right the way down. We know we have some resistance in Ireland already. It's potentially risky in areas where it's been used quite a lot, where they haven't got a response to it. You'd have seen some of cases, I imagine, coming back in again from flocks that have treated with triclobenazole, and maybe it didn't effectively kill.
Yeah, so resistance is a very, very difficult concept to get across in terms of liver fluke. I try and approach it simply. Triclobenazole, we need it. We have to protect it. It's our best product in terms of dealing with immature larval stages. So when a guy is facing a heavy challenge on ground in a year like this, when we've had just the climatic conditions that have created that on his ground, he needs to be able to get in there with triclobenazole. He needs it to be effective. So in order for to prevent resistance, what you need to do is you need to make sure that your population of fluke that you have on your ground is susceptible to it. And the way you do that is not by overusing it. So triclobenazole should be held in reserve until you need it, until it's the time of year in which you need it. Now, having said that, and accepting completely that there is a resistance problem there, I worry sometimes farmers are too quick to jump to thinking that they have a resistance when maybe it's unproven, and maybe when they can't be, when it's not really the case. And again, this goes back to the challenge that the sheep are facing on the ground. So remember, none of these products, triclobenazole itself, it has no residual action. So it kills off the fluke that are in the liver on the day you give it. If you put those animals back out onto the same very heavily contaminated ground again, which a lot of guys do, they're picking up those immature larvae straight away again. The other thing that happens with triclobenazole that can make it appear like there's a resistance problem when there isn't, is that triclobenazole needs to be metabolized by the liver to a certain extent. So when you use it in sheep that have very severe liver disease, that metabolization doesn't happen as effectively as it should. So that can lead to an inefficacy of it. So it might look like it's not killing the fluke, and which it's not doing. But it's not that the fluke are resistance; it's that the animal just hasn't been able to metabolize it into its active form to make it available there to kill the immature stages. The other thing we see happening is people not dosing to the weights that they should be dosing to when it comes to using triclobendazole. And if you don't, when you use triclobendazole, because it's your go-to product, because it's the most effective weapon you have, you need to make sure you're getting a full kill with it. If you're using it and you're not giving enough of it to a sheep, then what you're actually doing is you're selecting for the resistant parasites that are there. So any of them that are able to survive at a lower, maybe a low dose triclobendazole, they go on to reproduce. And now your farm is gradually becoming more contaminated with these resistant strains of the fluke. So, when you do use triclobendazole, it's very important you get in and you use it properly and you use it to the right weight, and that you use it at the right time, and that if you do suspect resistance there, that you talk to your vet and that you do an investigation into making sure that it is really resistance and that it's not just that the animals are becoming reinfected quite quickly again. Like we see time and time again with acute fluke, we see animals that have been treated with a triclobendazole, and then 3 or 4 weeks later, they're more sheep in with acute fluke. And that's not because the triclobendazole didn't work. It's because they were put back out onto ground that was heavily contaminated with these larvae, and that was back into that liver, and that liver was shot again within a few weeks.
Look, you've raised two very interesting points now. One is highlighting that problem of animals becoming reinfected, probably something that is more of a challenge this year, as you indicated earlier. But the second point is we can't underestimate the basics of correct dosing technique, estimating the correct weight, particularly in the case of ewes where it may be more variable. Generally speaking, we're about training, our eyes are about training with lambs, but you can't underestimate the basics. And just on the basics, Shane, like I suppose one other thing we have to be very conscious of too, flukicides tend to have long withdrawals, particularly if we're talking about treating lambs, and paying attention to that. We can easily forget if something has a withdrawal of 7 or 8 weeks, and they might be drafted. It's very important we pay attention to withdrawal dates on these products.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, because remember, we're producing food here, and the residues and things like that are tested for very closely, and rightly so. Rightly so. We have very good quality products going out there from this country, and it's important that we don't do anything to compromise that. Having said that, I feel for guys that are facing acute fluke problems late in the season. And it's a bit of my conversations with them is always a bit of if you talked to me 3 months ago, I'd have been able to help you. It's a bit late now, because with those long withdrawal times, maybe you can't use the products that are going to give you the best kill of those immature stages. But what I try and get across to those people when I'm dealing with those unfortunate cases is that by prudent use of and by adjusting your dosing regime earlier in the year, maybe you might be able to prevent that level of contamination then in subsequent years. And that's something a lot of guys don't think about. It's a new way of thinking, really, when it comes to parasite control. Is we have to think about not just dealing with the problem when it's there. We have to think about preventing the problem. And the main way when it comes to fluke to prevent that problem is by ensuring that you're not contaminating your ground, especially for late in the year. And that involves good control of fluke in your older animals earlier in the year, and then throughout the grazing season, that you're not contaminating and spiking your ground with these very high levels of larvae that might be present when it comes to September, October time. That's difficult. And it's something that I think sheep farmers need to speak to their vets on and get a bit of advice on, because it's something that, even when I try and advise a guy, not knowing his particular management practices and not knowing what he's facing on a day-to-day basis, there's a load of things that need to be taken into account, and especially with sheep farms, because there's a whole load of mixture of different management systems goes on them, and what's practical for one person might not be practical for another, and that's a conversation that needs to be had with somebody with the knowledge, and I'd be arguing that's your vet, and it should be had very early in the year. So if you've had a fluke problem this year, the best bit of advice I can give anyone is talk to somebody over the winter now. Get your plan in place for how you're going to minimize your problems for next year, and not be relying on the luck of the weather one way or the other next year. It's possible the weather can have an impact, but it's possible to do this. And I see guys around here where we're dealing with wet ground, we're dealing with intensive systems, and they do manage to do it very well by clever use of flukicides early in the year, by preserving ground and preserving pasture for finishing lambs later in the year that isn't heavily contaminated. And there are ways of doing it, but as I say, it's not something that we'd be able to cover on a podcast.
No, but it's an important point of actually putting a plan in place that looks at it over a longer period of time. It's not just a car crash scenario where we deal with the problem straight in front of us. There is a carryover effect of management from year to year. And look, certainly, as you're right, farms that house sheep not have an advantage over those that don't. It is farm specific, but I think that point stands. Like, consult your vet, look at it on an individual basis. Shane, look, I'm conscious I've held you for quite a bit on this, and we've discussed a lot on liver fluke. I'm going to throw a very simple one in, which is not very simple. Rumen fluke. Okay, so we talk about this quite a lot. Probably I'll put my hands up. The caveat is, generally speaking, we say it's not a big issue. What have you seen this year in terms of rumen fluke this back end? Does it pose a risk for some farms, and what should they be looking out for?
Okay, so rumen fluke is complicated, and most of the time it causes no problems at all. And we know from doing our fecal egg counts that we see rumen fluke eggs in cattle and sheep throughout the year, and we see it throughout the country, but especially in the wetter climatic areas of the country, we see every carcass we open here in Sligo RVL has some adult rumen fluke there. With rumen fluke, the damage is caused by the larval stages, and it's caused specifically in the small intestine, and it's very dose dependent. So it depends on how many rumen fluke eggs that an animal has been exposed to over a very short time period. So this is where the weather conditions this year are coming into play, I think, because we're getting reports this year of rumen fluke in cattle and sheep causing problems on farms where they've never had problems before. And we're hearing of these cases from drier parts of the country, and we think that that's related very much to the wet conditions that were present in August, September, where there was water lying on pastures that sheep and cattle were out on. This is the perfect habitat for the rumen fluke snail to produce the infective stages that's going to get in and that's going to cause damage in the animal's gut. So the problem with it, and we can talk slightly about the diagnosis of it, but the problem with rumen fluke is that it has to be diagnosed on clinical signs. Rumen fluke eggs in a dung sample mean very little, except to say that there are rumen fluke on a farm. But as I say, lots of farms have rumen fluke. It's causing no problem. But if you get animals that are getting dehydrated, that maybe are getting a very severe scour, that are set back all of a sudden, usually happens in the course of a few days, and they respond then to a rumen fluke dose, then this is what has been causing the problem. So it's a difficult one to explain to anyone, and it's one of these things that just needs to be considered when you get clinical signs of an animal set back, getting very dehydrated when you wouldn't have expected them to. And usually there's a history there of them having grazed waterlogged or wet ground in the few weeks previous.
Again, it could be very much farm specific.
It's hugely farm specific, and it's and two things go into that farm specificity in it. It's that the ground has to be there that becomes waterlogged in the first place. And, I think in a lot of drier farms, people never consider that there could be a rumen fluke problem there. But if, like this year, you get very wet conditions at a certain time of the year, that just creates the habitat for this snail to produce the rumen fluke stages that will infect the animal. And the other thing is that the animals are grazing those fields at that particular time of year. And again, that's awful farm specific. It's one that makes a lot of sense when you have the diagnosis and when you can say, oh, I know this was rumen fluke, now how did they get it? And you can trace back and you can find, oh yeah, that's exactly how it happened. But it's a very difficult thing when you're there wondering, oh, could it not be? And never had it before. So all I'm saying, and what I'd like people to be aware of, is that it's something that's out there. It's something we're seeing a bit this year. We're probably coming towards the end of it, I hope now. As we come to the end of November, we'd expect that the risk period for it is over. But it's one to hold in the back of the mind in case we get another wet year.
Jane, really appreciate you coming on. I think it's a very timely update. Thanks very much for your time today.
You're very welcome, Kieran. Absolute pleasure.
Okay, we're going to finish the episode up at this point. I'd like to thank Shane again for coming on with us and highlighting some of the key areas we need to pay attention to when we're talking about fluke and the potential challenge it poses this winter. I have included a link in the show notes to the Department of Agriculture's fluke forecast, which you may find useful. That's it for me for this episode. For updates from our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more episodes.